The second morning at Landing Zone X-ray began before dawn. November 15, 1965, the Ia Drang Valley in the central highlands of South Vietnam. About 450 men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry had spent the night holding a clearing the size of a football field against a force 5 times their number. At roughly 8:30, two F-100 Super Sabres came in low over the perimeter. They were carrying napalm. The lead pilot released his canisters on what he believed was the enemy tree line. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore watched the 6-foot canisters tumble down toward his own command post. The air controller, Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, screamed into his radio for the second jet to pull up. It did. The first one's load was already gone. The fire landed inside the American lines. 2 cavalrymen burned where they lay. This is the weapon the North Vietnamese built an entire doctrine to escape. It is also the weapon that morning was burning Hal Moore's own men. Napalm was not new in 1965. A team at Harvard led by the chemist Louis Pfizer had developed it in 1942 under a wartime contract logged as Anonymous Research Project No. 4. The name was a contraction of 2 ingredients in the original gelling agent, naphthenic acid and palmitic acid. Mixed into gasoline, the powder turned thin fuel into a sticky, slow-burning jelly that could be thrown farther and made to cling. Its first combat use came in 1944, and by the end of the Pacific War, it had burned out large stretches of Japan's wooden cities, including much of Tokyo. The public had never watched that happen. It had been called the winning weapon of Korea, and it entered the next war as standard equipment. What changed in Vietnam was not the chemistry, it was the camera. The version used in Vietnam was different. Napalm B replaced the old recipe with roughly 50% polystyrene, 25% benzene, and 25% gasoline. One writer called it bathtub chemistry. It ignited easily and burned long. It burned hot, between 800 and 1200 degrees Celsius, which is 1500 to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. Water boils at 212. Beyond the burns, the fire pulled oxygen out of the surrounding air and filled it with carbon monoxide so that men near a strike could suffocate without being touched by flame. The jelly stuck to skin and kept burning. People who tried to wipe it off only spread it and widened the wound. A burn that began on a hand could end on a chest. There was no fast way to put it out except to smother it, and smothering it meant pressing the fire into the flesh. The first napalm of this war fell on February 27, 1962, dropped by 2 South Vietnamese pilots trained by the Americans. By 1966, it was a core part of the bombing campaign. The monthly tonnage climbed toward 5,000 tons and peaked in 1968 near 9,000 tons a month. Across the decade from 1963 to 1973, about 388,000 tons of American napalm fell on Indochina. The comparison is the part worth holding on to. Korea, over 3 years, had absorbed 32,357 tons. Japan, in 1945, took 15,500. Vietnam took more than both combined, many times over. Somebody had to make it. In 1965, the Pentagon asked for bids from the 17 American firms that produced polystyrene. One of the winners was a company in Midland, Michigan, ranked 75th on a 1967 list of military contractors and known mostly for inventing Saran wrap. Dow Chemical became the military's sole supplier. That decision would follow the company for years. It was delivered every way the arsenal allowed. F-100 Super Sabres and propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders carried it in canisters that tumbled rather than fell, spreading the burn across a wide footprint instead of punching a single crater.
Navy riverboats mounted it in flamethrowers. Ground troops carried it in flame units. A single dropped canister could cover an area measured in thousands of square yards. In jungle, it was used to strip vegetation and open landing zones for helicopters. Against troops in the open, it did what a pilot once described in the plainest words on record. People have this thing about being burned to death. That was the real value. Napalm did not need to hit a man to work on him. It was a fear weapon as much as a killing one. And for an army that fought by dropping infantry into clearings and holding them with firepower called down from above, it was close air support of the most immediate kind. It could be walked in tight against a perimeter. That was its use. That was also its danger. The closer it landed to the men it was protecting, the easier it landed on them. The place that proved both halves of that sentence was a clearing in the Ia Drang Valley near the Chu Pong Massif, about 35 miles southwest of Pleiku, close to the Cambodian border.
In the autumn of 1965, the North Vietnamese had a plan for the Central Highlands. General Chu Huy Man commanded 3 regiments of regulars in the region. His aim was to drive east, cut South Vietnam in two, and do it before the American buildup was finished. First, he meant to wipe out the Special Forces camp at Plei Mai, 10 Green Berets and a few hundred Montagnard troops, by drawing out a relief column and ambushing it. The Americans answered with a new idea about how to fight. The 1st Cavalry Division was built around the helicopter. Whole battalions could be lifted into the jungle, far from any road, then supplied and shielded by artillery and aircraft directed from the ground by their own radio operators. On November 14th, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore took his 450 men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry into a landing zone marked on the map as X-ray. It carried the same regimental number George Custer had taken to the Little Bighorn. The first helicopters touched down at 10:48. By 12:15, the shooting had started. Waiting on and around the high ground were something like 2,500 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The arithmetic was not survivable by rifles alone. One platoon under Lieutenant Henry Herrick pushed too far chasing the enemy and was cut off, surrounded, its commander killed. The rest of the battalion dug in around a large termite mound that became Moore's command post, holding a perimeter while everything the Americans owned in the sky was funneled onto the tree lines. The battle was a contest of firepower. Artillery from neighboring fire bases, helicopter gunships, fighter bombers, and the heavy bombers stacked above all of it, and napalm brought in again and again against an enemy who kept coming in waves through the dark and the dawn. On the second day, the pressure nearly broke the line. Moore made the call an American commander makes when he believes he is about to be overrun: broken arrow. The words released every available aircraft in the area to his position, and the planes stacked up overhead, waiting their turn. It was in that crush of aircraft that the napalm came down on the wrong men. The lead F-100, lining up on what the pilot took for the enemy edge, released 2 canisters that fell inside the perimeter near the command post. The second jet, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Comstock, pulled off in time when Hastings screamed at it. The first load was already burning on the ground. Among the men it caught was Private First Class Jimmy Nakayama of Rigby, Idaho. The reporter Joe Galloway, one of the few civilians on the ground at X-ray, helped carry him toward the aid station. Nakayama was burned over most of his body. He died about 2 days later. He had become a father that same week. Moore did not stop the air support. He could not. He told Hastings to keep bringing it in because the alternative to dangerously close fire was no perimeter at all. The aircraft kept working the tree lines, and the line held.
Over 3 days at X-ray, the Americans claimed roughly a 10-to-1 kill ratio, a figure they read as proof that the air-mobile concept and the firepower behind it could win the war. This was Napalm's whole argument made in one battle. It saved the position. It also burned the men it saved. Both were true at the same clearing in the same week. The weapon could not tell the tree line from the termite mound. It could only be aimed, and aiming under that kind of pressure was imperfect. X-ray was not unique except in its fame. The pattern repeated wherever a small American or Allied unit held ground against a larger force. Support called down close, napalm walked along the wire, the attackers thrown back by fire they had no answer for. At Play May, weeks earlier, the defenders had brought strikes onto ground only meters past their own positions, holding through several nights against an enemy that had not expected so many aircraft or their willingness to fly at night. For the men under those flight paths, the sound was the most reassuring in the war, and now and then the last they heard. The same canisters that broke an assault could fall short. The North Vietnamese drew a different lesson from the same fighting, and it was the one that mattered most for the rest of the war. They could not match the firepower, they could not down enough aircraft, and they had no napalm of their own. So they decided to take the firepower away by standing too close to it. The battalion commander at X-ray put it simply: move inside the column, grab them by the belt. Get so near the Americans that the artillery and the aircraft and the napalm could not be used without killing Americans too. General Chu Hui Man said much the same afterwards. The closer his men came, he reasoned, the less the enemy's firepower was worth. The tactic took a name that lasted the rest of the war: grab them by the belt buckle, hugging. It was a doctrine built around a single problem, and the problem was American close air support, with napalm at the center of it. The fear the weapon produced is measurable in the tactics designed to escape it. An enemy does not rebuild the way he fights to avoid a thing he does not fear. But the quality that made napalm fearsome in the jungle made it ruinous everywhere else. It could not be aimed finely. It spread, it stuck, it burned whatever it touched, and it was being dropped by thousands of tons over a country full of villages. That part of the story came home through photographs. A January 1967 article in Ramparts magazine ran color pictures of Vietnamese children disfigured by burns, and the images helped move Martin Luther King Jr. to speak publicly against the war. Witnesses described eyelids burned past closing and skin that looked like raw meat. The anger reached Dow Chemical directly. As the only maker of the weapon, the company best known for Saran wrap became the only target available, its recruiters blocked on campuses, its name on signs that read, "Dow shall not kill." Dow argued that the military used napalm only on military targets and that it was not responsible for how the product was used. By 1969, Dow was out of the business. Others took the contract. The weight kept falling. The legal reckoning came slowly and stayed incomplete. In 1980, the United Nations declared the use of napalm against concentrations of civilians a war crime under a protocol that took force in international law in 1983. The United States did not sign it for another quarter century. The signature was finally added on January 21, 2009, the first full day of a new presidency. By then, the weapon already had a successor in the American inventory, the Mark 77 firebomb, different enough in its mix to carry another name, and close enough in effect that the distinction lived mostly on paper. The image that fixed napalm in memory was not made at a firebase. It was made on a road outside Trang Bang, a village about 30 miles northwest of Saigon, on June 8, 1972. South Vietnamese A-1 spy raiders had been working over communist positions near the village for 3 days. That morning, a strike fell on the wrong place. Among the people who ran out of the smoke was a 9-year-old girl named Phan Thi Kim Phuc. Her clothes burned away, napalm searing her neck, back, and left arm. She had third-degree burns over roughly a third of her body. Her right palm was an open wound where she had tried to wipe the burning gel off her own skin. An Associated Press photographer caught her running. The picture was titled "The Terror of War." It won a Pulitzer Prize, and it became one of the most reproduced photographs of the century. More than 50 years later, even the question of who pressed the shutter is still being argued over. The fire is not. Kim Phuc lived. The rest did the photograph.